welcome back. This whole evening is going to be a little bit of an experiment. I've never done this exactly this way before. I've never done this presentation before, but using this jumping off point is going to be a bit of an adventure. So I'm going to ask you, as we did last week, to please stand. We're going to use the same opening and closing song each week. Where charity and love prevail, there God is ever found, brought here together by Christ's love. By love are we thus found. With grateful joy and holy fear, God's charity we learn. Let us with heart and mind and soul now love God in return. Forgive we now each other's faults, as we our faults confess, and let us love each other well in Christian holiness.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Before the feast of Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to pass from this world to the Father. He loved his own in the world, and he loved them to the end. The devil had already induced Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot, to hand him over. So during supper, fully aware that the Father had put everything into his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God, he rose from supper and took off his outer garments. He took a towel and tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and dry them with the towel around his waist. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Master, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered and said to him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will understand later." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "Unless I wash you, you will have no inheritance with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Master, then not only my feet, but my hands and head as well." Jesus said to him, "Whoever has bathed has no need except to have his feet washed, for he is clean all over. So you are clean, but not all." For he knew who would betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." So when he had washed their feet and put his garments back on and reclined at table again, he said to them, "Do you realize what I have done for you? You call me teacher and master, and rightly so, for indeed I am. If I, therefore, the master and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you a model to follow, so that as I have done for you, you should also do."
So I'd like to start by just giving you an overview of what I hope we're going to do tonight. First, a very brief recap of what I offered as alternatives to Bertrand Russell last week, alternatives that hopefully allow us to engage this conversation about why I am a Christian. Then I'm going to just refresh your memory by replaying the foot washing commercial. Following that, we'll have a small group conversation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about symbols and interpretation. For those of you who've been to other series that I've done in the last couple of years, this is going to be a refresher. The premise of this is that we encounter God and one another and even ourselves primarily through symbols. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that happens symbolically so that can give us some tools to think about the ongoing reflection about the commercial today and what we're going to do in the next couple of weeks. Then we'll have small group conversation again. Then I'm going to say a few words about the importance of context in interpreting symbols. Then we'll have a large group conversation. I'll give you some more homework. And then a closing prayer. You can see that there's a lot of conversation tonight. I'm going to be doing some presenting and seeding the conversation, but really what I'm really interested in witnessing and hearing is the conversations that you have at your table and that you will report near the end of the evening. Okay? So there's no well, there's a lot of right answers, but there's no wrong answers. Okay? We want you to feel free to offer your opinions, to speak from your heart when we get into those conversations, because that's where the value of those conversations is going to lay. So you may remember that last week I shared with you why Bertrand Russell said, "I am not a Christian." And I analyzed briefly his arguments and offered what I thought were some weaknesses in them, and then said, there can be alternative ways to think about Christianity that allow us to say, I am a Christian. And one of the ways that I mentioned came from William James, a pragmatist philosopher. He wasn't talking about religion here, but I think what he says applies to our conversations. To judge the truth of something, William James argued, you don't need to trace it all the way back to its ultimate natures, what philosophers call its ontology. That may be inaccessible to you and not directly relevant anyway. What is important is what works. To put this in a Christian context, the God whom we encounter may ultimately be complete mystery to us, beyond our comprehension. However, what we take from our encounters with God is what is relevant. We might not be able and have to explain God's nature, but if it works, we learn something about God, each other, and ourselves. Okay, so one alternative, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is to say simply that for us, in our experience, in our teaching, experience, etc., Christianity works. I don't mean this in a flippant way. I'm completely serious about this. Why would a disciple follow Jesus, try to live as Jesus calls him to live, if it didn't work for us? Okay? Then I mentioned that we're going to look at symbols. We're going to try to engage Jesus as a symbol through which to encounter God, each other, and ourselves. The engagement of symbols is what's fundamental and primary. How do we connect with the symbols? Okay. Then, once there's an engagement, then we can interpret what that engagement means. And after we interpret that, then we can ask ourselves the question, is our interpretation on the mark? Is it true? And then, I pointed out that Russell seems to not be worried about anything but about the engagement or the complexities of interpretation. He's a kind of a scientific evaluator of data. Okay? So that, I think, is going to bring us to hearing and seeing again the commercial. Okay? So here are the two questions I'd like you to consider in the first small group conversation. You should recognize them because they were your homework questions. What about the commercial overall, and in particular scenes, drew your attention? And we should not expect that the same thing is going to draw people's attention, everybody's attention. So I would expect that there would be differences here. In fact, I'd be very surprised if there weren't. And then, what is there in your past experience that predisposed you to notice what you did? Notice these are interrelated questions. What drew your attention, and what predisposed you to be attentive to that? Okay? So remember, please be honest, please be respectful of what each other has to say, and have a good conversation.
That's it.
Okay, can we bring it back here, please?
Okay.
So did you all comprehensively exhaust the topic? There's still more to talk about. So what I would like to do now is share with you, again, for those of you who have been at previous series, some information about symbols and how they work and how they help us to engage our God, each other, and our world. And they're really meant to be tools and categories to help us understand what you were just talking about out of your experience. And I'm going to be relying on my favorite guy with symbols, Robert Cummings Neville. I mentioned this last week. He wrote this book called Symbols of Jesus, a Christology of Symbolic Engagement. Don't read this book if you're tired. It requires a lot of energy and attention. I've been a big fan of Neville's for probably close to 20 years, and I had to read it when I was awake. But it's got a lot of really good stuff. If you want to try it, don't let me keep you from doing it, but just be well advised, okay? So what is involved in symbolizing or symbolic engagement? Interpretation. Interpretation is the act of taking a sign to stand for an object in a certain respect. So think of it this way. Here's the sign, here's the object, and here's the interpreter. And the interpreter says, this sign says something about the object, but it's got to be said in a certain respect if it's going to be true. So the example that I like to use is here is a rock, here is the object, it's God, and I say, God is my rock. So in what respect am I talking about God being my rock? Is it a sure foundation? Is it a weapon that I throw at somebody else? Or is it something else? So a sign takes an object to be something in a certain respect with respect to that sign. Okay? And what Neville will say, and we'll get to this later, is that the truth of the sign is that what's important in the object gets carried over to the interpreter in the sign. Okay? That what's important in the object gets carried over into the sign for the interpreter to engage. So what's important about God, who is my rock, engages me when I use that sign in that certain respect. Okay? So I've already kind of explained this. The way in which the sign is said to stand for the object is the respect. This is an important concept because Neville says a lot of times people engage signs and they posit what signs mean, but they screw up the respect. And so the interpretation is just kind of crazy or off the mark or just plain wrong. So understanding the respect in which we take a sign to stand for an object is an important thing. And then he talks about reference. He says there's 3, maybe 4 kinds of reference. One is iconic. Iconic reference is when the sign looks like the object that it signifies. Okay, so here is the sign, which is a map, and here is the object that it stands for, which is the city. So someone who's familiar with the city is going to look at that map and say, or someone's going to look at the map and say, I think I know something about the city. So an iconic reference is one that looks like what the object says. Then there's indexical reference. I've only now come to appreciate what Neville says over and over and over again, and that is in religious symbolism, indexical reference is really, really important. Indexical reference is that in the symbol which gets our attention. It points us to the object, okay? Which is why I phrased the first question, what got your attention in these pictures? Because what you engaged and what got your attention would have been a form of indexical reference. And notice that sometimes the indexical reference isn't at all iconic. It doesn't always look like the map. But the important thing is it engages you, gets your attention, and gets you to go into a further exploration and interpretation of what the symbol's about. So Neville will say that we have in our experience all kinds of opportunities for symbols that will refer us indexically to God, or indexically to one another, or even indexically to ourselves. And so we want to value those symbols that get our attention and point us, like this guy's pointing to the stars. Then there's what he calls conventional reference. And that is, he also calls it extensional. So let's say that I show you a picture of a dog. And then in a circle around that dog, I have the word mutt, collie, mammal, pet, furry thing, etc. When we see that picture of the dog, that picture connects with all of those things extensionally. Okay? That's what he means by conventional symbolism. But the very interesting thing is, if we take any one of those outer words and put that word in the center, then we're going to have another series of words around that, and they're not going to be the same necessarily as the first one. So pet might say family, might say companion, might say responsibility, etc., etc. And then you take one of those and the same thing happens over and over again. So 3 kinds of references: iconic, indexical, and conventional. Now the important thing here is that the signs, especially the conventional signs, they're neither true nor false until we make an assertion about what they mean, until we use them in an active interpretation. Okay, so that's what he means by extensional signification. Okay. Oh, and I already mentioned they're layered. So when we engage one of those symbols, everything else in the layer goes along with it, and the other layers, they're kind of compounded one upon the other. So it's really very, very complex, and it opens up all kinds of opportunities for what something might mean when we engage through symbols. So I'm going to give you some examples from the commercial that we saw. I was standing. Did you pick that up?
Yeah.
That I was standing coincided with. And so what we want to make sure that we realize is that symbols are not just visual, they're sensual. It engages every one of our senses. And so there's a kind of overlap, there's a layering which is happening right there with that picture and also with the music. Now what I did as I was doing my homework was I went through this commercial and I stopped it at every new picture to try to see what I saw there. So some of you may have identified this picture, so here's what I saw. It was evening, it was night. And did you notice how many of the scenes took place at night? I would say most of them took place at night. What does that mean? What does night signify? What goes around that? What engages us about the night? I think what I saw here, and again, I might see something different because my experience is different. I saw what looked to me like a Latina immigrant girl standing in front of a parked bus with the lights on. Immigrants disembarking, standing around, their carried belongings on the ground. She's on her right foot. The left foot is held over a basin by a white blue woman on her knees. I was looking at this for probably 10 minutes before I recognized the fact that she was holding a baby. That's a not insignificant thing. What prompts someone to notice or not notice the baby? And what does that do for the impact of the symbol to engage and to say something about our God, ourselves, and our relationships to others? So thank you for that, Ida. See if there's anything else in it. Did you notice, as you were looking at these things, that in every scene, neither the foot washer nor the washee was wearing shoes or socks?
Yeah, okay.
Interesting, huh? Now, we can ask ourselves, what does that mean? How do we want to interpret that? There might be different interpretations depending on who we are, the experience, and symbols connect with different people differently. So the same symbol can speak differently to different people. And I also noticed that this was taking place in the middle of what looks like a rather affluent suburban neighborhood, a white picket fence, a basketball hoop. Think of those extensional things. Think of how each one of those things has connections and layers upon layers. And as we try to figure out how does this engage, what does it say to me, you can see how it would give rise to multiple interpretations and multiple different people. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Once again, I want to start by referencing the music. Two worlds colliding. You look at that picture, you can see how that is an interpretation, not necessarily of the musician, because this song is lifted from a different context. This is a deliberate lift of the persons who made the ad to make those connections. So there's an interpretation at play in this. So protesting crowds, young people, mixed race, facing each other on the steps, shouting at each other, holding megaphones and signs, and some of the signs say, "Shut him up," "Ban censorship." See, I'm confusing. "Shut him up," "Ban censorship," "Silence him, let him speak." So the signs reflect the two sides of the conflict. And what I noticed is that the two women in the scene where the foot washing is taking place are on different sides of the conflict. The woman on the right, her sign says, "Silence hate." And the woman on the left, it's lost in the bottom of the picture, but it says, "Let him speak." So they're sitting in the middle of the crowd. Okay? Two worlds colliding. On the left, an African-American woman dressed in denim coat, purple pants, holds the right foot of the other woman in her left hand, white cloth in her right hand, and looks at the face of the other woman.
Yeah.
On the right, the other woman, plaid shirts, jeans. I couldn't tell for sure. Is she white? Is she Latina? Or maybe she's deliberately vague in the artist. Long black hair, looks at the foot. And again, both are in bare feet, shoes to their side. Okay? So when you look at this, you get drawn to what did I notice? What were the indexical references that drew me into this, and how did it connect with all of those possible extensional references? What kind of, if we think about, let's think about an African-American woman at a protest, and think of all the things that would be associated in that circle around her in the central of this symbol. And think of all the things that you could connect with those things on that circle if you put that in the circle, so you can see the multi-layered implications here. So just one more. Did you notice the words? Never tear us apart. Okay? Again, the interplay of the verbal symbols, the musical symbols, and the visual symbols is noteworthy. So this is what I saw. It's night again. It was night in the other one too. So two elderly men, one white, one black, sitting in chairs in front of a door to what looks like a country house porch. Each has one foot in a big metal container. The black man's right hand holds the white man's left hand. They look each other in the eye as the song sings, and they could never tear us apart. Okay. Then there's a big dog lying down next to the white man's right. And then if you look carefully, you can see there's an image of a woman at work in the house through the window. Don't know if that's a relative or an employee or a servant. Can't tell from looking at the picture. And again, Neither one is wearing shoes. You can see the shoes to the right or to the left.
Where are the white guy's shoes? I don't see them.
Underneath,
I see a pair over here, but I don't see another pair.
you're right. But he's not wearing shoes.
No, he's not wearing shoes, but I was wondering where his are. That's the only picture where there weren't two sets of shoes.
It's kind of like, what does that mean?
And there's a water pitcher.
Yeah, well, Bernie said the dog's chewing.
I like that.
But again, do you see how this works? Something captures our attention. There's an indexical quality to the symbol that causes us to look at this and see something in it, and then to start making connections with those extensional symbols and to employ those extensional symbols to offer an interpretation. Ellen?
And neither one is washing your feet.
That's right. That's right.
They're like both in this together.
That's also worth noting.
Yeah.
So when I Mike,
I was going to say, there's someone sitting at that table to the left, reading a newspaper.
Yeah.
I missed that. I didn't see that.
I took it to mean kind of like, well, these two gentlemen are friends, they're, talking to themselves, and this other guy is like, whatever. or maybe not whatever.
What's the white man holding in his right hand?
Maybe it's a restaurant.
It
It looks like a bottle.
a diner.
Oh, yeah, they had beers.
Yeah.
Yeah, he looks like he's got a beard.
There's a beer
So maybe it's a
behind the
restaurant.
thing that says
Oh.
subscribe.
Oh, so maybe it's a restaurant.
Oh, yeah.
Could be.
There's a sign in that one window, and it looks like it says cold, like maybe, I
Cold.
thought it was a dinette.
Does it say
Oh, yeah.
closed?
This is the wonderful thing about symbols.
Yeah.
That they are, another technical word that's often used in religious circles, they're polyvalent. They give rise to multiple meanings. I'm trying to explain to you how they give rise to those multiple meanings and how some of those engage us, and some of those engage us truly, and some of them not so truly. Some of them move us towards the object that we think we're interpreting, and some of them dissuade us. Okay, then there's intentional symbols. So I already talked about extensional. Now, intentional symbols. The extensional symbols become intentional when we take one of those and we say, this is what I'm going to say the interpretation is about. I'm going to use this symbol to be the foundation of my interpretation. It engages multiple layers at once, and it can be true or false depending on whether it engages the object in a certain respect. Okay, yes, Ellen?
Can all this happen without thinking of these words?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, it does happen without thinking of these words. My point in this, though, is to show you how wonderfully complex we are. And when we begin to ask, how do we encounter God through Jesus Christ, we're going to have lots of symbols of Jesus, and all these things are going to be at play whether we realize it or not. So if we equip ourselves with some tools or categories, we might be able to identify some things at play that we might otherwise miss. I would say the vast majority of what these things talk about, we miss. It just happens so fast. But that's where indexical symbols are so important, because something captures our attention. Something rivets us and draws us in a particular direction. Okay? And other factors, Ellen, this is going to get a little more complicated. Context makes a difference. What context is there? What are the purposes of the interpreter? Why is this, what does the interpreter hope to gain by engaging this symbol in this way? What is the predisposition of the interpreter? That's why I asked a question about the history and what shapes your personality. Those are going to affect what symbols get connected. And then developmental levels. Neville will say, for example, that someone who is a neophyte in a particular religious tradition is going to connect with religious symbols in a way that's different than somebody who's been at it for a long time. Okay, so all of these things are going to affect what symbols get noticed, how they get noticed, how they connect or don't connect with what the object is all about. One of the things that Neville says is that symbols have secondary references. And by that he means that they not only refer to the object, but they refer back to the interpreter. So the symbols say something about the interpreter in the very act of interpretation. And what it discloses about the interpreter sometimes says something about what the symbol says, about the object, and sometimes it says, well, this is why the interpreter took this to be the symbol in a certain respect. So I did a little research about possible interpreters, possible secondary reference. So I'm going to just share with you some of what I found. I was amazed at how much writing has been done about this particular commercial. I was not aware of it when I first came with this. So one says that this commercial was directed at young people and those skeptical of religion. How would that be the case? Well, maybe by trying to modernize, an ancient symbol. Maybe by trying to provide something that had a certain degree of surprise and shock value. David Green. David Green is the owner of Hobby Lobby. You may remember Hobby Lobby is a business that has been actively involved in anti-LGBTQ things, and it certainly would be on the right side of the spectrum. This is what David Green, who helped bankroll this He Gets Us thing, he says, we are wanting to say, we, being a lot of different people. Isn't that interesting? We, being, what different people? Who are us? We, being a lot of different people, want to say that He gets us. And then he says this, Jesus understands us. He loves those we hate. Think about that. He loves those we hate. I think we have to let the public know and create a movement. Again, here is a secondary referent looking at this symbol, and it's bouncing back to disclose something about him to us. Also, someone says that this is directed to digital natives who understand the difference between slick marketing and authenticity. Money that could have been used funding community programs and advocacy for the oppressed, such as refugees, LGBTQ individuals, and abortion rights, and the poor. So this is a secondary referent who finds something to be critical about with respect to what's happening in this commercial. I don't remember all the affiliations of these folks, but here's another one, a guy named Robbie Starbuck. The He Gets Us feet ad about Jesus seems to imply that Jesus was good with all kinds of sinful behavior. He wasn't. He didn't go hang out with prostitutes or any other sinner because he accepted the choices they made. He did it to inspire them to change. Okay, you can see that what we have here is a particular disposition that is disclosed in the interpretation that is offered by the one who's doing the interpreting. Secondary referent. A guy named Vinnie James. I think this guy was a musician. Superbowl warning. The He Gets Us ad is totally deceptive. Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, followers. These were people who already believed in Jesus. He then told them to wash each other's, believers' feet. Christianity shouldn't be rewritten as political ads. Again, keep in mind that what's at play here is what Neville would call secondary reference. Something about the interpreter is being disclosed. This guy's a researcher, and he said that the ad was intended to appeal to groups that may have felt excluded or repelled by the church in recent years, like members of the LGBTQ community, different races and ethnicities, those who lean more liberal politically, or people who have kept up with the scandals of abuse. And then there's another guy named Romano who said, despite the campaign's ostensible goal of bridging gaps across a range of identities and experiences, each image instead reasserts an uncomfortable us-them dynamic between the foot washer and the washee. And then he summarizes his article. It's not that the goals of this ad campaign aren't noble. If a similar Christian ad campaign emerged from a group whose larger aims were actually about upholding and embracing poor, underrepresented, and underprivileged people from all walks of life, without trying to condemn intrinsic parts of their identities and experiences, most viewers would probably cheer for them. Many would probably want to support them, regardless of their own religious beliefs. Unfortunately, that's not what's going on here. Okay? So, again, what's the important thing here in going through this? It says to me how symbols have primary references and secondary references back to the interpreter. So when we're going to be asking, how do symbols of Jesus help me to encounter God, each other, and ourselves, how we answer that question says as much about ourselves as about what else we do, maybe more. So that's one of the primary ways that we discover something about ourselves, when we discover ourselves to be secondary reference. Okay, small group conversation. I think you may have already addressed this, so I'm just going to give you a few minutes. This was from your homework. What effect, if any, did the fact that this commercial ran during the Super Bowl, with all its other attendant attractions, have on those who viewed it? Remember the extensional references that are at play. How did they influence the viewer's perception of its message? So just take about 5 minutes to just give a real quick response to that. I think by now it's evident that the context and situation, predispositions of people affect the interpretation. Affects what signs get noticed, what signs get put into play. So I'm not going to dwell on that anymore. But I want to just mention some examples of context that I noticed. First of all, the Super Bowl. This took place during the Super Bowl. The game itself and its violent nature, right? The economic inequality of pro athletes relative to others in society. The outrageous cost of ads and ticket prices and things necessary to attend the game in person.
Yes.
Other ads, hype, attractions. Ostensible connection to religious prayer before the game in the locker room, pointing to the heaven after a touchdown and Hail Mary passes. And that's just, again, the tip of the iceberg. So when we're looking at what do these symbols in this foot washing commercial connect to, for some, it's connecting to those things. And those things are shaping what they're experiencing and understanding. I already mentioned David Green and Hobby Lobby.
Yeah.
He bankrolled a good deal of this, and other conservative evangelical right-wing groups with political connections doing the same. So it's not always everything that meets the eye. That said, it doesn't mean that there can't be something of truth and of goodness that is carried over from these signs into the person doing the interpreter in a way that is significant. Okay? Again, that's the wonderful thing about how symbols work. They're polyvalent, and it's necessary as we make our interpretations to take the next step and say, is what's important in what is the sign is pointing to, is that coming over into the interpreter? Is love for my neighbor that which is coming through to me in this symbol? Or is it a veiled attempt to say something in one direction and to do something in another direction and thereby give myself some cover? Okay? So context, and the context is much more complicated than that, but it reinforces the sense that context makes a difference in interpretation. So when we're thinking about how we encounter God, ourselves, and each other through symbols of Jesus, all of this is going to be in play. And again, Ellen, I have great sympathy with you. We're not going to be in touch with all of those things all at once, but the hope is that knowing some of these things will sharpen our faith senses to be able to notice some things and perhaps take away some things that we wouldn't have noticed without that. Okay? All right, now I want to tell you a story. I was going to tell this earlier and I forgot. Some of you know this story. For years, on Holy Thursday, instead of having the priest wash the feet of 12 men, we have taken to heart that Jesus said his disciples should wash each other's feet. So during the Holy Thursday service, we invite anybody in the assembly who wants to come up to have his or her feet washed and to wash someone else's feet. Been doing that for years. Okay? So about, I'm going to guess, 8 years ago, maybe longer, there was a woman named Myra Euclid. Remember Myra? Myra was a wonderful woman. She died a few years ago. But about 6 weeks after Holy Thursday, she made an appointment with me. And she said, I was at the Holy Thursday service, and I want you to tell me what happened in that service. And she wasn't talking about the fact that people could just wash each other's feet. She said, something happened to me. I was sitting in the assembly, and there was a young woman from across the room who came to me and said, I'd like to wash your feet. And so I sat on the place where that I was supposed to sit, and she washed my feet, and something happened in me that I simply cannot explain. I cannot explain, but it was real, and something really touched me. And I'm still trying to figure out what that was. So I'm here to have you tell me what happened. So I said, Myra, you got to think about iconic and Dexo. What was going on here was Myra was saying, this worked for me in a way that I can't fully explain. It worked for me in a way that put me in touch with God, with the meaning of Jesus, with a sense of my own self-understanding, a sense of how I relate to others. And so we talked for a good part of an hour about all of that. And I finally said, Myra, just keep thinking about it. Be grateful for what happened. So when that would be, to me, a kind of paradigmatic example of how we encounter, through symbols of Jesus, a symbol of Jesus, our God, each other, and ourselves. Okay? So think of Myra. Make sense? All right, so now here's one more question. I thought we could talk about this in a large group. This, again, was the last question in your homework. What does all of this suggest about how people experience God, each other, and themselves through Christ? I just told you what I think. What do you think? How did you answer the question?
I think all of our experiences are different because we're all coming from a different place.
Exactly. And there's something good about that, because we say that our God is bigger than all of us,
Right.
and bigger in the most important senses of the term. So it's not surprising that, given everything we've talked about, symbolic encounter, that we're going to meet God differently. Doesn't mean that we might not make some mistakes about what we claim about God and about Jesus, but it certainly stands to reason that there are going to be different experiences. There were all kinds of other people in that room when we were washing when Myra's feet were being washed. Nobody else came and asked me that. Doesn't mean that things didn't happen. In fact, one year, another man came to me, and he was kind of blown away. He said he and the man whose feet he washed, and vice versa, had a conflict with one another. And in the course of washing each other's feet, something happened deep inside them that helped to resolve that conflict, and they couldn't be mad at each other anymore. Okay, what does this say? This symbolic encounter, the symbol of Jesus, what does that say about God? How God was at work there? What does it say about their relationship with each other and what it is or ought to be? And what does it say about themselves? Okay. Make sense? Okay. Yeah, sure.
Well, I was kind of struck by not only that people react differently, but they can react in really opposite ends. Like some of us were very moved and touched. Other people are angry because they spent all this money. You know, I don't know, I guess there's not one right and one wrong, but maybe. I know it's just that kind of polarized.
Again, I would use Neville's language here. The truth of the symbol is that what's important in the object gets carried over into the person who's the interpreter through the sign. And to use this, God as a symbol, if someone posits that this symbol of Jesus is being used in order to be a front for dividing people rather than uniting them, then we would recognize that you can have both interpretations, but that one's going to be true and one maybe not so much. So it doesn't mean that we stop unpacking the truth of the jest.
As far as that last question, I would say that greeting people or meeting people with an open-minded and open heart, and as we sing in all our songs, seeing Christ in one another, so that we're kinder towards each other. We don't go to that angry place or that confrontational place.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up on that phrase, seeing Christ in one another. Which Christ do we see? Do we see the Christ who washes all these feet, or the Christ who only washes the feet of his disciples who've already repented? Both of those were identified. So it's you can see why this is kind of a lifelong kind of journey that we're on. And you can see why, over the course of different life experience, we might discover something different about Christ that we didn't know before. Yes?
I think when they said it was a waste of money, that they could have fed the poor. It's only a waste of money if you don't take what you see in those pictures and make it a part of yourself and the way you work with other people. Mm-hmm. And those people that put that out there are hoping that we will take what is given to us and spread it around.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you go to the website of He Gets Us, that would be their stated purpose. I can tell you that from having researched reactions to the ad, that there are other people who don't see it quite the same way. So it's, I'm not denying what you're saying. I think there's value in what you're saying. What I'm saying is that there are others who would have a different opinion. Not surprising. Mike?
I was thinking, St. Francis, preach the gospel always and use words if necessary. Preach the gospel and put it on the Superbowl if necessary. So it costs money to be on the Super Bowl. What do these football players earn? What does the coach earn? What does the owners of the team earn? Couldn't we spend that money somewhere else? Look at what teachers earn. Well, that should be, what do these rock stars earn?
Right?
It's.
So let me just pose a hypothetical question. How would you like to be the person who stands in front of a Sunday assembly and have to preach about symbols of Jesus? How would you like to try to say what is going to be a good indexical referent to people in this room? And I can tell you that there are all kinds of times when people come out and will say to me, I really liked your homily, and I will ask, what did you like? And they'll say something that A, was a minor point to me, or B, that I didn't even realize I said, or that I didn't think I said. But I think that's because all of this, what we're talking about, is at play. Now, homily is only one kind of way of naming and interpreting symbols of Jesus. So now your homework. Should you decide to accept it? Question?
What did you think of the ad when you first saw it?
When I first saw it, I was stopped in my tracks. I said, I can't believe this ad is here. And I was very favorably impressed because over the years, the foot washing for me has been a very powerful thing. I first became aware of the way we do the foot washing ceremony here when we were at Catholic University back in the mid-'80s, and the campus ministry was celebrating Holy Thursday that way. And then when I came back to Cleveland and was in parish ministry, it just seemed to be the right way to interpret that story. And I named a couple of experiences of people who have reported back what happened in their engagement with that symbol of Jesus. So I was positively impressed. I was a little surprised when I started doing the research about the things that I missed. But the more I lingered with each of the scenes for 10 or 15 minutes, I began to see some of the things that I had missed the first time around that might have given me a slightly different interpretation. Okay, fair enough?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, so, homework. And these questions are on the back of the purple sheets that I gave you. Okay, what symbols of Jesus work for you? In the sense that William James talks about work. That is, what symbols in your experience have made a positive difference in your relationship with God, with how you relate to others, and with how you have come to know and understand yourself. Okay? And then the second question, what symbols of Jesus do not work or no longer work for you? That is, no longer seem to significantly make a difference in your relationship with God, with others, and in you as you come to know and understand yourself. Sorry I didn't get that exactly accurate. Now keep in mind that symbols of Jesus can be out in the scriptures, they can be from liturgical experiences, they can be from experience of just working with people at church, they could be experiences that happen when you're at work, when you're not even in a explicitly religious context. Symbols of Jesus can confront us in just about any kind of context. So I'm asking you to think about this and to do your best to do that and come prepared to talk about that next week. Make sense?
Yes.
All right. From where I'm standing, I just want to say you did a great job with your homework. Class, I give you A's. And I'm a tough grader. Okay? So thank you very much for that. I really am convinced that we learn from each other as much as from the one standing in front. And so I thank you for that. So now I'm going to invite you to stand. So let's wrap up by singing the last three verses. Let strife among us be unknown. Let all contention cease. Be God's the glory that we seek. Be ours God's holy peace. Let us recall that in our midst dwells God's begotten Son, as members of His body joined, we are in Christ made one. No race nor creed can love exclude. If honored be God's name, our family embraces all, whose Father is the same. Thank you. I just want to do a postscript to the story of Myra. I had the occasion to preach at her funeral, and in that funeral homily, I suggested to the people that when Myra got to heaven, she was going to point her finger at God and say, "What happened there?" I want you to tell me. All right, so thank you all. Go in peace. If you have the opportunity to help gather pencils and some of the remnants of the table, please do.